Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we're going to go over Unit 1.3 in ACE International History. The big question for this review is, why did Japan emerge as a world power and what was the impact on international relations? So, let's get into it. In the first half of the 19th century, Japan was an under-modernized country with a rigid class structure. The samurai was the military leader, with the shogun being the autocratic head of the Japanese government. In this time period, Japan successfully resisted pressure to establish trading rights with nations like Russia, Britain, and the USA. However, the USA was particularly desperate to gain trading rights in Japan because they wanted new markets to export their goods in, needed access to Japan's ports for their vital supplies during wars like coal, and in 1849 they needed to rescue American sailors who had been shipwrecked off the Japanese coasts. The ship was called the Preble. Now, since the USA really wanted to trade with Japan, in 1853 they sent a fleet of ships under the command of Commodore Perry. Japan demanded these ships to leave, but Perry refused and started a gunfire as he wanted permission to deliver a letter from the US President Fillmore, making it clear that the USA expected trading rights in Japan. When Japan refused once more, Perry threatened to pursue a large-scale war. As Japan was not industrialized at the time, they had no choice but to open their borders to the USA. In 1854, Japan signed a treaty giving USA trading access in 2 ports. In 1858, they signed another treaty giving foreigners even more ports. This was called the Fillmore and Perry Incident. Japan then realized that if they didn't act, they would become imperialized just like the weakened China. So in 1867, Japan underwent the Meiji Restoration, when their citizens demanded the restoration of an emperor as head of government instead of the military shogun. Then Emperor Meiji decided to further modernize the country to resist imperial powers. By 1869, they established a centralized administration, united all of Japan under one capital city and government, and created a new constitution based on the successful German model. Additionally, they rapidly industrialized and modernized their country for their own military needs. To do this, they modeled education systems, forms of government, army, navy, and industry on those of foreign nations who they feared the most. Mines, iron foundries, and shipyards were also quickly developed. To cover the cost of this, they exported more goods, especially textiles. Moreover, 1/3 of the national budget was spent on the army and navy itself. Military service became compulsory for adult males, and school-aged children were taught to be patriotic and show obedience to their emperor. Modernization helped maintain its independence. However, being an island country, they possessed limited natural resources and were reliant on imported coal and steel. So they began to seek overseas possession to gain these resources they lacked. Disputes over the control of Korea in China led to the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894, where Japan wanted to test its newly modernized military. And Japan ended up winning. So, under the terms of the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895, Japan gained control of the strategically important Port Arthur. This was a shock to major European nations. Russia greatly resented Japan's control of Port Arthur, who wanted a warm water port for trade. So, they created the Trimble Intervention, which I expanded on in my last video. And the port was given to Russia. This humiliated Japan, who decided to increase their military strength. By the 1900s, Russia occupied all of Manchuria. This caused alarm in Japan, since it was obvious that Russia's next move would be to seize Korea, which was under Japanese control from the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Britain also saw Russia as a threat to its own commercial interests in China. However, at this time, Britain was following a policy of splendid isolation, where they stayed out of European politics. Then, in the early 1900s, Britain realized they needed to abandon this policy. This caused Britain and Japan to form the Anglo-Japanese alliance, where they agreed to remain neutral, but if either country faced war, against two or more opponents, they would come to its aid. Now, they both felt protected in case France or Germany came to defend Russia in a brewing war. This war was called the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. Now, let me explain how this happened. Japan wanted to negotiate with Russia, prepared to recognize their right over Manchuria. Russia refused to negotiate and invaded Korea, bringing Japan into a war with one of the world's greatest powers. Then, in February 1904, Japan's ships entered Port Arthur, where Russian ships were unprepared for battle. This began the war. With the Russian fleet widely dispersed across the world, Japan had an advantage. They quickly took over Port Arthur and moved into Manchuria, taking over Mukden. Then, while Russia was sailing through the North Sea, they mistook British fishing boats for warships and fired on them. Britain was outraged and denied the Russian fleet across the Suez Canal, which can be seen right over here. So, the Russian fleet had to take the longer route all the way around Africa just to get to Port Arthur over here. Finally, they arrived in May of 1905, when they finally faced Japan's ships. However, outdated Russian ships were of no match for Japan's modern warships, so Japan had defeated the Russian Navy. In 1905, negotiations took place in Portsmouth, New Hampshire in the USA, where both countries signed the Treaty of Portsmouth, recognizing Japan's overwhelming victory in the Russo-Japanese War. Now, Japan was recognized as an imperial nation by the Western powers. However, they were increasingly concerned with Japan's expansion in the Far East. Still honoring its alliance with Britain, Japan entered World War I by declaring war with Germany in 1914. While the Western powers were fully occupied with fighting in Europe, Japan focused on the Far East region. Japan attacked German-controlled regions of the Shandong province, which is highlighted in red over here on the map, allowing Japan to extend its interests without facing opposition. Then, the Chinese agreed to Japan's demands and reduced its 21 demands policy. The Western powers were greatly concerned by Japan's economic and political interests in the Far East, so the USA adopted the open door policy to protect its own commercial interests in China. In 1902, Britain had signed the Anglo-Japanese alliance to gain Japan's assistance in protecting its trading interests in China. But now, a few years later, Japan seemed a threat to those interests. However, there was little Britain could do about this. Japan was a vital ally in the war against Germany. So, that's all for ACE International History Unit 1.3 review. Stay tuned for Unit 1.4 coming soon.